All right, let's take a trip back to the 1920s, where we're diving into Denmark. One of those countries that just felt like it had it together while much of Europe was dealing with the aftermath of World War I. The 1920s were a pretty fascinating time for Denmark, and today we're going to unpack how their economy, politics, culture, and everything in between were looking back then. So grab a snack, sit back, and let's dive in. First up, let's talk about Denmark's economy. Unlike the chaotic scenes happening in other parts of Europe, Denmark was living pretty comfortably. The economy was stable, and a lot of that came from the country's strong agricultural roots. Denmark was one of the top exporters of dairy, meat, butter, and grains like wheat and barley. Seriously, the world was depending on Danish farmers for a lot of their food. But it wasn't just farming. Denmark also produced textiles and machinery, contributing to steady industrial growth. In other words, while a lot of Europe was still struggling with post-war recovery, Denmark was sitting pretty with its strong agricultural exports and booming maritime trade. Not bad, right? Now, on the innovation front, things were moving forward, but Denmark wasn't exactly at the cutting edge of industrialization. That said, they were really good at improving farming, especially dairy farming, which was a major part of their economy. They were leaders in agricultural machinery and modern farming techniques. Oh, and their transportation game was getting better too. Railways were expanding, and ports were upgraded to help with international trade. The 1920s also saw electrification spreading through urban areas, though the countryside still had some catching up to do. Politically, Denmark was incredibly stable during the 1920s. They were under a constitutional monarchy with King Christian X, who reigned from 1912 to 1947. Denmark didn't get dragged into the global conflicts that so many other countries were embroiled in, mostly because they were pretty good about sticking to their neutral stance during World War I. The political scene was becoming more progressive, with the Social Democrats rising to power, pushing for reforms like social welfare. But there were still tensions, particularly around the region of Schleswig, which had recently returned to Denmark after the war. People were figuring out how to integrate the German-speaking population there, which led to some political debates. There were other tensions, too, between liberals, conservatives, and socialists, as everyone was trying to figure out the best way forward for the country after the war. When it came to military power, Denmark kept it small. They weren't out looking for a fight, and they weren't heavily involved in any major conflicts during the 1920s. They focused mainly on defense, and their coastal defense system was top-notch because, well, Denmark's right there on the northern edge of Europe. Their military was a bit outdated compared to other European countries, but it didn't matter too much since they weren't trying to get involved in wars. Rifles, artillery, and naval ships made up most of the arsenal. Nothing too advanced, just enough to keep the peace and stay neutral. As for social conditions, Denmark was growing more prosperous by the day. Thanks to the political stability and the rise of social welfare programs, people were seeing improvements in their living standards, especially in cities like Copenhagen. Education was a big deal, and literacy rates were high. But of course, not everything was perfect. Rural areas still faced some struggles, and there was a noticeable gap between the rich and the working class, especially in agricultural communities. The middle class was growing, but the working class movements were also gaining strength, pushing for better wages and working conditions. Speaking of welfare, Denmark had some pretty solid foundations for social safety nets, even in the 1920s. They were rolling out unemployment benefits, pensions for the elderly, and starting to build up their healthcare system. Cities were seeing better access to modern healthcare, while rural areas had some catching up to do. But the groundwork was being laid for what would eventually become the modern Danish welfare state. Now, let's get into Denmark's ethnic makeup during the 1920s. Denmark was pretty homogeneous, with most people being of Danish descent. That said, there was a small German-speaking population, particularly in the region of Schleswig, which had recently returned to Denmark after the war. Besides that, there were small communities of Jews, Romani people, and a few other immigrants, mostly in the bigger cities. Immigration wasn't huge at the time, so Denmark wasn't as ethnically diverse as other parts of Europe. The government was conservative when it came to immigration, mainly focused on preserving Danish culture, but the German-speaking population in Schleswig did spark some tension, especially after the territories returned to Denmark. So who were the key figures shaping Denmark during this time? Well, King Christian X was obviously a big deal, known for his leadership and for keeping Denmark neutral during the war. On the political side, Thorvald Stauning, the leader of the Social Democrats, was making waves. His party was pushing for social reforms that would eventually help lay the foundation for Denmark's welfare state. And don't forget about the cultural side of things. Artists like Wilhelm Hammershøi and writers like Hans Christian Andersen, yes, the fairy tale guy, were still having a major influence on Denmark's culture, even though modernism was starting to make its way into Danish art and literature. Politically, Denmark was a constitutional monarchy with a parliamentary system, so they were operating under King Christian X. The Social Democrats were on the rise, and Thorvald Stauning was a central figure in this. He helped establish many of the social programs that Denmark is known for today. On the other hand, the liberal and conservative parties were pushing back, particularly when it came to economic policy and social welfare. But despite these differences, Denmark's political environment was generally cooperative, all with the goal of maintaining stability and neutrality in a turbulent Europe. When it comes to crime and underground movements, Denmark was pretty peaceful in the 1920s. Sure, there were some protests and strikes from labor movements, but overall, the country avoided the kind of political unrest seen in other parts of Europe. The social democratic push for reform really helped alleviate a lot of tension, and there weren't any big underground organizations causing trouble. Now, let's talk about culture and the arts in Denmark during the 1920s. The country was experiencing a cultural renaissance. Writers like Johannes Fies Jensen and Karen Blixen, Isak Dinesen, were gaining international recognition. Meanwhile, in the world of visual arts, modernism was starting to take hold, and Danish artists were experimenting with abstract and symbolic styles. Copenhagen, as the cultural heart of Denmark, became a hotspot for these creative movements. Even Danish cinema was starting to get noticed. As for religion, Denmark was predominantly Lutheran, with most people still belonging to the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Denmark. However, like much of Europe at the time, there was a growing trend of secularism, especially in urban areas. People were becoming more interested in modern philosophy and existentialism, which led to a more individualized approach to spirituality. The state church still played a major role in social life, but traditional religious dogmas were starting to be questioned. Danish folklore also held a strong place in the culture. Folk tales about trolls, elves, and ghosts were still popular, especially in rural areas. And let's not forget the lasting influence of Hans Christian Andersen, whose fairy tales, like The Little Mermaid and The Ugly Duckling, continue to shape the cultural imagination. These stories were part of the larger Danish identity, blending history with mythology and magic. In terms of historical events, the big one for Denmark was the return of Schleswig from Germany in 1920, which marked a significant territorial change for the country. But beyond that, Denmark's gradual shift towards social democracy really began taking shape, with the Social Democrats pushing reforms and building the foundation for Denmark's future as a welfare state. And finally, let's talk about the stereotypes people had about Denmark in the 1920s. Danes were seen as hardworking, pragmatic, and peaceful. They were also known for their sense of equality and social responsibility. On the international stage, Denmark was often viewed as a neutral, safe haven in a world full of conflict. So, there you have it, the 1920s in Denmark, a time of stability, social progress, and cultural growth. While the rest of Europe was still reeling from the effects of the war, Denmark was quietly carving out its place as a progressive, peaceful nation that would eventually become known for its strong welfare system and high quality of life. Denmark was definitely ahead of the curve in many ways, and their story in the 1920s is one worth remembering. Thanks for tuning in to The World as We Know It and joining me in another chapter of world history. As always, there are more detailed notes in the description, and we welcome any requests or recommendations in the comments section. If you found this video helpful, entertaining, or educational, please consider liking this video and subscribing to support our channel. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.